In this video, we'll talk to a professional historian and ask if the Germans could have repulsed the D-Day landings, or if Allied success in Normandy was inevitable. If you're a fan of Little Wars TV and you saw our epic D-Day wargame a few weeks ago, you know that in that game, our German players made a concerted counterattack to shut down the Omaha Beach sector. We'll ask a military historian if the loss of Omaha Beach would have had a lasting impact on the operation. And this is what makes wargaming so fascinating. Testing different strategies can produce different outcomes. We'll talk about the potential loss of Omaha Beach, Rommel and Rundstedt, German intelligence failures, and Hitler's grand designs in France. Could the Germans have won in Normandy? Stick around as we explore the intersection of history and wargaming on Little Wars TV.
My name is John Prados. I'm a historian and a senior fellow of the National Security Archive. I work on military history, intelligence history, and I teach young scholars. I do believe that the loss of Omaha Beach, the American loss, would have been only a marginal setback to the Normandy invasion. The invasion forces in Normandy were so powerful, and by the way, the success of the American landing at Utah Beach was so considerable that a successful German defense force at Omaha would actually have been encircled against the coast and wiped out, and would not have significantly prevented Allied egress into the interior of France.
I'm joined now by Tom and Tony, each of whom played on opposite sides of our epic D-Day wargame. And Tom, it sounds to me like Dr. Prados does not think that the German masterstroke in our game of crushing Omaha Beach would have really made a strategic difference in the end.
Well, I would say in the game it did a great deal for German morale.
Yes.
And possibly historically, but I would have to agree. I think historically the weight of the assault on Normandy wasn't going to be set back by one or even two beach losses.
Funny that you mentioned one or two beaches.
Yes.
But once the first Allied soldiers touch down in France, the end is inevitable.
Well, I know in our game, you guys actually did destroy the Omaha beachhead, but historically, for a period of several hours in the morning, Omaha basically was shut down.
Yeah.
I mean, the American landings had been sort of stemmed back for at least a few hours.
Right. Well, there's a reason you do 5 beaches, right? So
Yeah.
you keep them guessing across a pretty wide front, and the Germans, I think, responded aggressively to that area, and were able to, delay them for some time. But again, it's not going to make a difference. It makes a difference in hours, but in days, probably doesn't set the schedule back too much.
And to your point, Tony, I did ask Dr. Prados about not just Omaha Beach, but zooming out to a more strategic level, whether or not they could have thrown back the D-Day invasion across all 5 beaches.
Hindsight is always 20/20, but even with 20/20 hindsight, the Normandy invasion was a toss-up. After the Normandy invasion, Adolf Hitler called a conference of his top commanders at a place in France called Margival, where the Germans had prepared a command post for fighting in the West. The conference there focused on a strategic response to the Normandy invasion. I think that insufficient attention has been put into this particular evolution of the German strategy. The outcome of that conference, aside from Hitler chewing out his commanders and their attempts to defend themselves, was that there should be a multi-corps size attack, an army size attack on the Allied enclave in Normandy. If the Germans had successfully marshaled the forces for such an attack and carried it out within a relatively short space of time, there might have been a chance of wiping out the Allied beachhead. I think that initiative failed for a series of reasons that are not all German, but that are related to the reasons that the Normandy D-Day resistance also failed. That is, the reserves could not be marshaled quickly enough. The arriving reserves were drawn off into partial commitments against advancing Allied forces. The Allied air power weakened the German response each time that they attempted to put themselves forward. And in the end, the time lags and delays were such that the force, or Hitler's idea of a force, only got concentrated in time to counterattack against the American breakthrough at Avranches and create the Falaise Pocket.
Well, guys, I actually hadn't heard that much about the Margevall Conference until talking to Dr. Prados, but I sort of feel like by mid-June even, it's almost too late for the Germans to organize something.
Yeah, I think at that point, if Hitler releases those assets and stays out of the way for a few days, everything has to go right, and never does. And I also think the seriousness of Allied interdiction of movement, daylight movement, I mean, it's just hard to see them moving enough forces to the beachheads to make a difference.
I would agree there. I think there's just too many variables that the Germans can't control to create the perfect scenario that they need for this to succeed.
I just feel like once the beachhead had been made at all, I mean, even a couple of days at this point, less than a week into the operation, the biggest variable, completely outside of German control, is Allied air power. I mean, it is almost impossible to overstate how overwhelming it was.
Sure.
The Luftwaffe isn't even in the sky at this point. I mean, German vehicles could not move a couple of kilometers on the road without drawing Allied air attention.
Right. I think the Allies would have loved it if they were in the air and the Germans had the ability to mass, a couple corps heading for the front. That would have just been a dream.
Shooting turkeys,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Right. I think that would have accelerated the end of the war by getting everybody out in the open where they could be shot up.
Well, this question about Allied air power touches on something else we asked Dr. Prados about the Rommel versus Rundstedt debate. Which of those two deployments before the landings the Germans should have followed? And you can probably guess where Dr. Prados came down on that.
I think Rommel. But let me come back. The position of Field Marshal von Rundstedt is a mystery to me, because he had taken over the command in Western Europe months ahead of time and had a good amount of time to observe the effective tactics of Allied air power all over the West, and more strategically as well. Now, I'll grant you, in Russia he did not have that same experience, but I don't think he gets the benefit of the doubt. So Rundstedt should have had a much better appreciation for the strength and power of Allied air. I believe that Field Marshal Rommel was correct to argue that Allied air was going to stall German reinforcement attempts and that therefore the forces needed to be stationed closer to the beach.
Dr. Prados echoes what Greg and I talked about in the beginning of the Overlord video, that Rommel ultimately should have been the man in charge in the West.
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to argue against that point. I think the bigger question that I would have in this video is, even if Rommel had been in charge in the West and Rundstedt's out of the picture, German intelligence failures leading up to Overlord, that was their only chance to throw back this invasion. I mean, I think the three of us all agreed that a big multi-corps German attack a couple weeks afterward, that wasn't going to get it done.
In hindsight, I suppose it's amazing to look at the German intelligence failure here, because the Allied landings in Normandy, that wasn't something that they cobbled together in 3 months. That's something that had been building for more than a year.
The largest amphibious operation in history.
Exactly.
How do you miss that?
That's a good question, the question of intelligence failure on the German side in Normandy or at D-Day. But actually it subsumes other questions. Are we really talking about a German failure or a successful Allied deception? The Allies very consciously created a plan to make the Germans think certain things about potential invasions, among them being that there was a threat to Norway, or that there was a threat to southern France, or that Allied production had fallen short, so there weren't enough landing craft, or that there was this whole army group commanded by George Patton that was really going to carry out the invasion, and everything else was just a deception. Or even that the Allies were going to invade in Normandy, but it was going to be next week, not today. Oh, and by the way, we consciously let the Germans take aerial photographs. Like in the case of the Norway invasion, we let their reconnaissance planes through to take photos of harbors that would have been bases for such an invasion.
So on the question of whether or not the Germans could have possibly repelled the D-Day operation, I think that it really does come back to a question of the intelligence planning.
The success, I don't know whether to give credit to the Allies for the success of their disinformation counterintelligence campaign, or to blame Germany. The failure is monumental. I realize that the Allies have a massive effort to conceal what's happening and when it's going to occur and where it's going to occur. But the fact that the Germans, up until the day of, in fact, after the invasion, are still not convinced that this is the invasion is just a monumental failure.